So I'm Paul Locke. I'm the Assistant Commissioner for the Bureau of Wayside Cleanup in Boston. And I'm going to talk about two things that we've talked to you about before. Do you remember vapor intrusion and soil? What I hope to convey today is a little bit of a summary and kind of going back and reminding you about these topics, but also to talk about the steps that we've taken and kind of where we are. Because while it seems that we don't have a lot of progress sometimes from the... I'm in Boston, so I do the policy and regulatory development, and that tends to be a slow process. So it's great when I can come and talk about something that, okay, we've done this, and here's what we're doing now. And we've made some progress from the last time we talked to you. So first, we'll do vapor intrusion and trichloroethylene, and then we'll take questions on that if you like, and then we'll do a completely different topic, soil management. And my contact information is there. So first, a recap of what vapor intrusion is. And I'm going to go through this in a little bit of detail because I do want to impress upon you that it can be very complicated. And as we come and work with you on vapor intrusion sites in your region, it may be frustrating for you, and it certainly is frustrating for us, in that each case tends to be very different and has complicating factors. And we can't give the people that live or work at these sites or the responsible parties who are trying to clean it up, quick and easy answer that this is causing that. It often takes a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of sampling, and a lot of thought to figure out what is actually going on before we can recommend steps to do it. So in some ways it's challenging, it's exciting, requires us to bring all of our technical abilities to it. And from a technical point of view, I love those kind of projects, but sometimes I just wish it were nice and easy and clear. This isn't. So vapor intrusion, as you all know, houses breathe, except unless you build these like airtight, highly insulated buildings that don't breathe and are so fuel efficient, energy efficient that there's no air transfer, and then you end up with different problems because you're trapping all the moisture. Most houses breathe, and that's a good thing to some extent. You have air exchange. It's through the doors and the windows and the walls. You have chimneys, so you have the stack effects. The wind creates that, and it sucks air up the chimney, and it's supposed to do that. If you have a basement, if you have a foundation, you have cracks in the foundation almost inevitably. If they're not there now, they will be there sometime in the future. And you have air coming in from the soil as well. And if you have utility lines, and most of us do, then the packing around the utility lines provides a great passageway for air to come in that way as well. And usually if you go down in the basement and you see where the sewer pipes leave and the water pipes come in, you often see area around those pipes. And that's a way for air to get in. So in a completely normal house, the house breathes, the air comes in, goes out, and that's a good thing. Houses also contain chemicals, and this is one of those complicating factors that make this challenging. You bring dry cleaning into your house. Dry cleaners most of the time use tetrachloroethylene or perchloroethylene or PERC, PCE. That comes in the house. It's there. You have stuff in your basement. Paint cans, thinners, paint strippers. If you build model airplanes, you have all sorts of glues, and any hobby usually has some chemical associated with it. That's all in your basement, and you haven't thought about it for 20 years. It's still there. You have gasoline in mowers that may be in your basement, other sorts of equipment, and you have all the cleaners. So you have all of that stuff, and it's complicating because all of those chemicals are off-gassing low levels, but significant levels and measurable levels. So if you're trying to figure out a vapor intrusion pathway, you have to take into account what's already in the house. It's also very hard to kind of explain the relative effects of the chemicals you bring into the house versus what's coming in from the outside. And that's a communication challenge at a lot of our sites. Some houses, luckily not a lot of them, but it certainly seems that way, have contaminated soil or groundwater near the building. And that's where the Wayside Cleanup Program comes in, and that's where we may be talking to you, working with you to figure out, okay, we have volatile organic compounds we're worried about the volatile ones because those are for vapor intrusion, because those are the ones that off gas and create vapor which gets sucked into the house. And it could be in the soil near a building. It could be in the groundwater. And when materials off gas, they get into the air pockets between the soil particles, and that's called soil gas, the gas in the soil. And that's the stuff that can get sucked in to the building, particularly through cracks in the basement, but also through the utility ductwork, and get brought into the building and cause exposures that might be problematic. And that was a simple case. In the real world, and you think that we're really overdoing this, but no, you can have really complicated things. You can have multiple sources here in ASC above ground soil tanks. It leaks. You have contamination that not only goes into the soil near a building, be sucked up into the building, but it goes and hits the groundwater. It can get into the bedrock. It could be DNAPL, dense non-aqueous phase liquid, essentially pure stuff that sits in the bedrock and continues to act for a source for decades later. Even after that building is long gone and cleared and a daycare is put up in its place, you can still have this stuff sitting here contaminating the groundwater. That groundwater can bypass a bunch of these other buildings and actually have effects somewhere down gradient, complicating the assessment process. These people would have no reason to believe that something that happened up here 2 decades ago could have an effect on their indoor air. And that's what we're dealing with, and that's what, when we come knocking on your door, you will be helping us deal with. In between, you can have other kinds of contamination. It might be from underground storage tanks at gas stations. It could go directly from the soil into the buildings. A lot of complicating factors in this. So this is to really impress upon you why some of these things take a while to figure out even what's going on, not to mention then what to do about it. All of that is leading up to trichloroethylene. And I think we've talked about this at MHOA before. Trichloroethylene, I mentioned perchloroethylene, which is tetrachloroethylene, the dry cleaning stuff, and we've been concerned about that for a while, and we've been concerned about trichloroethylene for a while. It's a chlorinated volatile organic compound. It was used a lot in the past, less so now, but we're still living with the past. It can be a breakdown product of tetrachloroethylene, but it's also used in its pure state as a degreaser, a solvent. So you see it a lot of manufacturing in this region where you have a lot of old metal plating facilities. They use trichloroethylene, in the 50s and 60s to clean off the parts. That stuff, if it got into the environment, is probably still there. And we're dealing with those effects. I gave some of the physical constants. It's volatile, so we are concerned about it off-gassing and the vapors that might result from that. And it's a dense liquid, so the DNAPL I showed in the slide before, I put that there because it's dense, non-aqueous phase liquid. Trichloroethylene will tend to sink. It will sit in the bedrock. It can act as a continuing source for a long, long time. And almost, unfortunately, it's somewhat soluble. It's not soluble enough so that it just dissolves in the groundwater and 5 years later it's all gone downstream. And it's not so insoluble that it sits there and you don't have to worry about it. It's just soluble enough so that it will sit there as a continuing source for a long time. Just sending off small amounts, enough to be problematic for a long time. It also doesn't tend to biodegrade all that easily, so you're kind of stuck with it. It will be a source for a long time. And the reason that we bring it up now is fairly recently, in 2011, the U.S. EPA changed after almost literally a couple decades of studying trichloroethylene, they came out with new toxicity information based upon a review of hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of studies on TCE, and this information has been challenged since it came out by the chlorinated solvent industries and all of those, and it has continually been kind of upheld and reinforced. So we feel fairly confident that the toxicity values that we're using to evaluate the risk posed by this chemical and to determine kind of what actions are necessary is grounded in good science. And the concentration for indoor air or for inhalation exposures is 2 micrograms per cubic meter. That's a level that, in the way that EPA looks at these things, it's the reference concentration. That's a level that would be safe for short-term and long-term exposure. That's a safe level. Keep that in mind. That level is based upon, among other things, effects on the development of the fetus, cardiac malformations, which means and fetuses don't develop for all that long, and the sensitive period for cardiac development in a fetus is a short window of time of a couple weeks early on in the pregnancy. So what this means is that the exposures that we're really concerned about for trichloroethylene is a short-term exposure to women who are pregnant or who may be pregnant and don't even know it yet, that could have potential effects on the development of the fetus. That is a challenge that we're struggling to face. It's something that short-term exposure is something we're not good at. We are very good at it, actually, and we're gaining a lot of experience, but we're not used to it. This is not typical of the kind of exposures that DEP is concerned about. We're usually concerned about longer-term exposures. This is very short-term, very acute, and a very sensitive subpopulation. So the question is, I say that 2 micrograms per cubic meter is safe. At what point above that does it become not safe? And that's what we're struggling with and working with the Department of Public Health. We worked with the Department of Public Health and a advisory committee on health effects. We're blessed being in Massachusetts. We have all of these universities that we can draw people from to give us advice. And they have identified levels for women who may be early on in the pregnancy where they recommended that we begin taking action. So it's relatively low levels of TCE in soil and groundwater can actually cause concentrations in the 6 to 20 microgram per cubic meter range that we're concerned about. So they're low levels, but significant. And there's really a limited number of options of what you can do with this, given the complexities that I showed you, that I tried to reinforce, of when you find these trichloroethylene exposures in indoor air and you need to take action very quickly. If you have a pool of DNAPL that's acting as a continuing source, it may take a while to be able to deal with that. So there are some measures to interrupt the exposures, to put in units that might clean the air at that point, in the building, in the basement. We have those with their ventilation options. There are systems that you can put in underneath the slab that may take a couple months to do the planning and construction for that. So there are things that you can do in the very short term, and we've been kind of working on sites, active sites now, in order to, not get practice, but we have been getting experience working on a number of these sites and setting up systems so that we can respond very quickly. We've bought these air purification units. We have a bunch of them that are stored in our regions that in very short notice we can bring out and install to begin reducing the levels immediately in the air. We have that option. There are ventilation and sealing of cracks and things like that. We have contractors who also have access to those. We have been putting in sub-slab depressurization systems, essentially radon systems, that are very effective at reducing the vapor intrusion pathway. It doesn't clean up the soil or groundwater. It's not that kind of system, but it interrupts the pathway and essentially blocks or reroutes the contamination outside the breathing space, outside the building. So there are things that can be done, and we're learning how to do that on a very quick time period. And we've talked a little bit about that with you now and the problems of vapor intrusion. What I really wanted to highlight to you today is that we are now turning our attention to sites that have been closed using old standards for trichloroethylene. That in the past, in 1994, 1998, assessment of the site was done. Cleanup may have been done to some point, but they used older standards, not considering 2 micrograms per cubic meter, this new information from the EPA. And the question has come up, and we're beginning to deal with it now, of, what about these old sites? Are there exposures that we should be concerned about? So our plan is, and we've been working with the Department of Public Health and working with outside stakeholder groups, and we'll work with the local boards of health as well as we go through this, is that we are beginning the process of identifying these sites and contacting owners. And we're trying to identify them, screen the sites, identify the potentially most problematic. We don't know. A lot has changed since 1995. The contamination may have moved on. The levels may be lower. There may have been renovations in the building that either increase potential exposures or reduce potential exposures. We don't know. But we're going through the sites, trying to identify those that are the most, or could be the most problematic, begin contacting those owners. And what we're willing to do is to do the initial sampling to find out if there is a problem. We're not embarking on an enforcement initiative. We're not calling into question the cleanups that were done using the old standards, whether they met the old standards or not. That's not the issue. The issue we're trying to get now is, now that we know more about this chemical and we know that there's a potential health effect of concern, are there exposures where we would want more action? So we're willing to put the state's money, DEP's money, out there to do that initial assessment. We would offer that to the owners of the properties, the occupants of the properties, in order to kickstart that. When we have done similar things in the past for tetrachloroethylene, we find that a lot of people are willing to step up and do the work themselves, but we are willing to do that. And as we do that, we make that contact. We'll be working with DPH. We'll be working with the local boards of health so that we're all on the same footing. We all have the same information. We're all kind of trying to answer the questions of how is it, is there an exposure of concern? How can we eliminate or reduce that exposure to acceptable levels, and then work on the bigger picture of how can we clean up the trichloroethylene that's in the environment that's causing those problems in the long term. So you notice I didn't give you any of the numbers or any of that stuff because it's all online, and rather than kind of spout off the numbers, which you're not going to remember anyway, or you write down and it'll be out of context, our website has a bunch of this stuff. I guess all of the slides and everything will be available. They are available, so you have all of these. We have fact sheets about if you have questions about the details of the toxicity information for trichloroethylene, that's there in as much detail as you want to and feel qualified to delve into. You're more qualified than a lot of people who are looking at these. We also have more fact sheets geared towards the actual owners or occupants of the buildings, whether they're residential settings or occupational settings. Those are there. That's kind of at a simpler, more straightforward, less toxicology approach to doing it. There's documentation, all that. And we have technical guidance in general about dealing with vapor intrusion. We have an interim guidance that's available online, and we are working to finalize a new version of that as well. The last slide for TCE. So why don't I stop there? And do you have any questions about vapor intrusion in general or trichloroethylene in particular? No. Oh, you're an easy crowd. Okay, well, feel free. You have my contact information if you have any questions. Also, in the Southeast region, Gerard Martin, who's, you can call the general number for our Southeast Regional Office. Gerard Martin is our Deputy Regional Director for Wayside Cleanup. He would be the point person to contact for vapor intrusion. Actually, for any of the Wayside Cleanup stuff, the soil as well. Yes?
So there may be some funding available in the future for DEP to do sampling in DEP-specified sites, because there's no new indoor air quality regulations that we need to be aware of as well.
No, there are no new regulations. It's unlike some of these presentations. There are no new regulations. What this is actually applying the old existing regulations, and how do we do that based upon new scientific information? How do we do that? The money that I talked about is not new money, unfortunately. Wayside Cleanup, years ago, there was a bond fund that was established and renewed several times since then, that the Bureau of Wayside Cleanup has access to, and that we use whenever we need to do work. So our emergency response work, for instance, is often paid out of that bond fund. We have a statutory obligation to deal with any conditions that pose short-term risk. The regulatory term is an imminent hazard. We have a statutory obligation to eliminate or mitigate imminent hazards that are there, and we are willing and able to spend that bond money in order to identify those situations and to deal with them as necessary. As you probably understand, that bond fund is not endless, and it has to be available not only for this kind of work, but also you have, say, hypothetically, a tanker truck overturning at a rotary and spilling its contents into a canal or something. We have to have money available to deal with those sort of things as well. So we will use our money to identify imminent hazards, to see whether these exposures are occurring, and then from that point we'll work with the potentially responsible parties, whether they are the old owners or perhaps the new owners, to have the situation mitigated. And who pays for that will depend upon the situation. As complicated as the environmental part of it is, the liability situation is equally complex, and there will probably be a wide range of different situations about the state doing some of the work and some of the private parties going back perhaps decades doing some of the other work. But one thing I do want to emphasizes that we don't want the question of money to stand in the way of identifying the problem. And that's why we're willing to spend our money on that initial part.
When you say that you're looking at old sites, are you looking at straight data or multiple lines of evidence, including those used to close sites using risk assessment?
I love when people talk about multiple lines of evidence. The initial screen is based upon what's in our files, so it will depend what the information that's available in order to evaluate will depend upon what's there. And again, it will range. The most likely situation is that a site that was closed in 1996 had groundwater information that showed that the concentrations of TCE in the groundwater were lower than the then applicable standards for the groundwater protective of the vapor intrusion pathway. Those groundwater standards are now much lower. So where they were able to rule out a vapor intrusion problem in the past just using the groundwater data, now that same groundwater data would indicate a potential for vapor intrusion. And those are the sites that's the kind of information that we'll have mostly at our fingertips in the files. If we have data that uses more sophisticated risk assessment that almost implies that they actually sampled indoor air, that would be a wealth of more data. That would be better data. We probably have fewer sites that have soil gas data, fewer sites that have actual indoor air sampling data. But we will use and look at and evaluate whatever we can find in the files. But that's why we may need to go out, and most likely we'll need to go out and take additional samples. Yes?
One follow-up, sorry. Will the searchable site list be updated to indicate that anything is happening in terms of review? Or will that just happen on a case-by-case basis with notification directly to the owner?
I'd like to say that this happens in every single case. Our goal is to have any of the work that's done be available, and our staff have the ability and the direction to, as they work on these sites, to upload the documents to the site file viewer as well, because we want it to be kind of open, what's happening at sites. And what we do is part of the documentation of the site. So we try to have our work be uploaded as well. Does it happen in 100% of the cases? Probably not. 98%, I'd be really happy. But it's an extra step which sometimes gets overlooked or somebody gets sidetracked. But that is the process, and the goal is to have all of the site information available on the file viewer. Yes?
Was DEP reopening sites that they once closed years ago?
I don't like the word reopening.
Well, it's a private.
We are reviewing the closed. We are reviewing information on the closed sites. Reopening. I don't like the word reopening. I prefer reviewing. And if we find something, I believe the protocol that we'll be using will be to issue a new release tracking number and treat it as a new condition, rather than, say, invalidating the old work. The question is whether there is something there now that we should be concerned about.
So if it's privately owned and you want to go back on the property, you have to resubmit a new order of non-compliance with the property and thoroughly clean up?
The question is whether we would need to do a notice of non-compliance and do an order in order to get access in order to do it. My answer would be no. Typically, that actually isn't the process, because they are not in non-compliance, and we have found that in the process that we tend to use is that by calling and then following up with a letter explaining what the situation is and asking for access and asking for kind of working cooperatively with the new owners, most of the cases they are as interested in finding out if there is a vapor intrusion problem as we are, and dealing with it in the most efficient way possible. They may not like it. They may not be happy to get that call, but I think they kind of appreciate people looking back and dealing with the things that may have been left behind.
But if they're not appreciating, you're still going forward to clean it up. Right?
If somebody doesn't appreciate it, there are a variety of options that are available. And as I said, it's going to be a very complicated situation. There may be current owners, and because of the liability structure, particularly for hazardous materials like trichloroethylene, the liability goes back to previous owners. And so what happens at a particular site and who pays and who does the work, you're going to see a wide range of combinations of situations. And what we're trying to keep in mind is that This is not a case of non-compliance and enforcement. It's a case of trying to find the best way of moving ahead to address any issues that are found.
Still sounds like a reopening of the case. I just want to close. And then not the case, no, the state wants to reopen.
And many people will look at it that way. The great thing about the Wayside Cleanup Program and the Massachusetts Contingency Plan, the regulations that enforce it, it is a risk-based program. It is a semi-privatized program. And it is, by statute, looks at reasonably foreseeable use and looks at risk. And there's flexibility in the program for there to be contamination left in the ground or left in the groundwater with demonstrations that, given what we know today, there is no risk. There's also the option, and many people do, clean up to background. And part of what making the decisions and closing the site, in the private sector, a private party is making a decision, and part of it is a feasibility decision, that it poses no risk, and I am deciding not to remediate further to background because of X, Y, and Z reason. Leaving things in the environment entails the possibility that either it's going to move in a way that you didn't anticipate, that people will change the building or the structure or the soil so that exposures are created. The only way to have no ongoing liability and no potential future risk is to remove all of the contamination. Anything less than that leaves open the possibility that that contamination is going to cause a problem in the future. It may be a small probability, but you don't know. You can't have it both ways of having a flexible system that allows people to consider risk and consider future use and give people absolute assurance that there will never be any problem in the future. We don't often go back and look at old sites. We try to limit that, or we do limit that, to a situation that poses what we think is a clear health risk. But if we see that health risk, we're going to take action to deal with it, because that's first and foremost the directive of the department.